Good evening. I'm John Miko, the Executive Director of the Union League Legacy Foundation. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this very special public affairs program tonight. The Legacy Foundation is the nonprofit charity of the Union League of Philadelphia. Our mission is to create better informed, more engaged citizen leaders. And of course, to be a citizen leader, you have to know what's going on in the world around us, and that's what the public affairs programs are really all about. So thank you for being here this evening. Again, this is a pop-up, if you will, public affairs. We had just scheduled this about 9 days ago, and within a few hours, you all had signed up. So I'm thrilled that you're here, and I welcome the hundreds of other people that are watching via live streaming. Of course, the tragedy in Ukraine, the league, as it always does, jumps into action, and our league members who are here saw last week an email about contributing both material and money to a relief, the United Ukraine Relief Committee. I'm really happy to say that as of this afternoon, we had raised over $25,000 in contributions, so thank you. If you would like to make a contribution to that effort, you can put it on your chit. You can go on to the online store. We'll have chits outside the doors when you leave. If you'd like to make a contribution, just put Ukraine Relief or something like that. And the Union League would be happy to process that gift for that worthy cause. So the Union League the Legacy Foundation has lectures like this all the time on a lot of different important topics. We have 3 programs upcoming I just want to let you know about. One is next Tuesday, March 22nd. And if you haven't signed up for that one in person, you'll have to watch it virtually because it is also going to be a sold out program. It's with Heather McDonald, the attack on Western civilization, and I'm thrilled to say that Victoria Coates, who you'll hear from later this evening in just a moment, will be our moderator for that great program. On the 12th of April, we have a library hour, The Age of Acrimony, with John Greenspan, and John's going to talk about a time in our political life that may even be more acrimonious than today. So sometimes history gives you some context, which can be helpful. I hope you can be there on the 12th. And then the 26th, we have a program, it's a 200th birthday program on Ulysses S. Grant. His birthday is actually the 27th, but we have Ron White, a great historian, who will be with on the 26th. And that's part of our celebration of the 160th anniversary of the Union League of Philadelphia. Everything that we do is made possible through voluntary contributions, and the person on the Union League Legacy Foundation board who's in charge of that is a wonderful league member, volunteer, generous man, both of spirit and his resources. And to introduce our program will be the chair of our development committee, Dr. Gary Dorsheimer. Gary.
Thank you, John. And my thanks to all of you for being here this evening for this very timely program. This program and all of the Legacy Foundation programs are made possible through the generous contributions of the members and others who share our same values and who want to reach out to as many people as possible to share those values as well. Our Legacy Foundation funds our scholarship programs, exhibits, civics education, and the care and preservation of our incredible art and archives of the Union League. My thanks to all of you who support us. If you do not yet support us, make a gift. I believe that we do this through our Legacy Foundation, which is more important now than perhaps at any time in our lives. Before I introduce tonight's program, I want to acknowledge Union League President Craig Mills. President Mills, thank you for your leadership in all these endeavors. Now, our program tonight is on the Russian invasion of Ukraine. As John said, he was tirelessly putting this together within days of the invasion starting. Moderating our discussion this evening is someone I'm privileged to introduce, Carol Raleigh Flynn. Ms. Flynn is the president of the Foreign Policy Research Institute, a foreign policy think tank here in the Philadelphia area. Raleigh's a 30-year veteran of the CIA. She's held senior executive positions, including director of the CIA's Leadership Academy, director of the Office of Foreign Intelligence Relationships, associate deputy director of the National Counterterrorism Center, executive director of the CIA Counterterrorism Center, and chief of station in major posts in Southeast Asia and Latin America. We're very fortunate to have as our two panelists, League members Victoria Coates and Ed Terzansky, who our moderator will introduce further. So please join me in welcoming Raleigh Flynn, Victoria Coates, and Ed Terzansky to our program.
Okay. First of all, thank you, John and Gary, for inviting me and for that very generous introduction, and to the Union League Legacy Foundation for hosting this program. I'm deeply honored to be here. So on to tonight's important topic. As I arrived tonight, I came up here and I saw some of you looking at your phones, and it occurred to me, we are just riveted by this seemingly David and Goliath battle that's going on in Eurasia. Well, tonight we want to get beyond the headlines. We want to go deep and talk about what is really going on here. How did we get here and why does it matter? And I can think of two more perfect people to do that than our very distinguished guests here tonight, Victoria Coates and Ed Terzansky. So let me say a little bit about them. There's a lot to say because they are very distinguished. Victoria Coates joined the American Foreign Policy Council as a distinguished fellow in strategic studies in January 2022. Ms. Coates works on regional issues such as energy policy, countering predatory Chinese activity, expanding the historic Abraham Accords between Israel and the Muslim majority nations, and establishing a US-led Middle East strategic alliance. She routinely appears on TV and radio outlets such as Fox News, CNN, OANN, Newsmax, The Hugh Hewitt Show, The Eric Erickson Show, and The John Batchelor Show. Her writing has appeared in Bloomberg, FoxNews.com, The Jerusalem Post, The New York Post, Newsweek, The National Interest, National Review, The New Criterion, The Wall Street Journal, The Washington Examiner, and The Washington Times. Ms. Coates previously served as the Deputy National Security Advisor for the Middle East and North Africa on the National Security Council staff and the Senior Policy Advisor to the Secretary of Energy in the Donald J. Trump administration. She also served as the National Security Advisor in the Office of Senator Ted Cruz and as Director of Research for former Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld's 2011 memoir, Known and Unknown. She holds a BA from Trinity College, an MA from Williams College, and a PhD from the University of Pennsylvania, all in art history. She's also the author and presenter of dozens of publications and conference papers worldwide on the intersections of art and history, including David Sling, A History of Democracy in 10 Works of Art, and the forthcoming Seeing the Light, A History of Christianity in 12 Works of Art, which are part of a projected trilogy on the key tenets of Western civilization, democracy, the Judeo-Christian moral code, and the primacy of the individual, which explains next week. Oh, yes. Over a 4-decade-long career, our other speaker this evening, Edward A. Turzanski, has been a practitioner, researcher, historian, professor, essayist, and commentator in the fields of intelligence, espionage, national security, and foreign policy. He's a trustee of the Union League Legacy Foundation and a life member of the Association of Former Intelligence Officers having served with the U.S. intelligence community during the Reagan administration with postings throughout the Middle East, Central Asia, and Eastern Europe. During the George W. Bush administration, he served on the U.S. Department of Justice's Anti-Terrorism Advisory Committee, ATAC, for the 3rd District and the Department of Homeland Security's Port Security Committee for Philadelphia. He's also a life member of the Naval War College Foundation, the National Association of Scholars, the National Rifle Association, and the Polish Police Association of Philadelphia. Mr. Terzansky is also a member of the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition Advisory Board and a senior fellow with the Foreign Policy Research Institute, where he was its first John Templeton Fellow. His commentary on national security, intelligence, political and diplomatic affairs has been heard over more than 4 media outlets over North America and on the BBC's World Service, CBC, and CTV News in Canada, Fox News Channel, and National Public Radio. So, without further ado, I would like to turn to the issue at hand, which is what's going on, how did we get here, and why does it matter? And I'll start with Ed.
All right, so let's start with how we got here and realize that Vladimir Putin is an aggrieved man. He's very unhappy with the way in which the Cold War ended. He holds Gorbachev and members of the military responsible, and I'll explain the military portion of it later on. And he looks at Ukraine, and his firmest belief is that Ukraine was the historic root of the Russian people. These are Russians. The notion that they are somehow a people apart is anathema to him. And he has been, since 2014, trying to get back what he believed is properly Russian. He's very upset that Khrushchev handed over Crimea. He thought that was an abomination. And by the way, Putin has said the worst geopolitical tragedy in history was the dismantlement of the Soviet Union. People automatically say, well, that means he wants to rebuild the Soviet Union. No, he wants to rebuild the Tsarist Empire. There's a difference. There's a difference in terms of historic perspective, what he thinks. So he has made the following assumptions. And first of all, what triggered him, to my thinking, is the way in which the United States left behind American citizens in Afghanistan as we were pulling out. When he looked at this, he said, you know what? They don't, meaning we, don't have the stomach to fight with a forward deployed force to protect our own people, to bring them out of a place like Afghanistan. And if you are an acolyte of Reagan's in any way, as I am, Reagan noted that weakness is provocative. And he thought, this is the historic opportunity for me to regain this land. He's just concluded a deal with the Chinese where nothing is off the table in terms of their cooperation, at least that's what they've said. And for him, the stars aligned in a way where he was aggravated because the Ukrainians kept on talking about NATO membership. We were talking about NATO membership. He's turning 70 this year. Maybe there's something there for amateur psychologists. I'll say this. If you've taken a look at him, his face has gotten rounder, puffier. There's some speculation that he has some form of cancer or Parkinson's disease. So it's a steroid treatment. People are saying Vlad's gone mad because of the steroids. No, look, he murdered people in Chechnya. That's how he got to be president. He murdered people in Georgia, in Ossetia, and Abkhazia. He murdered people in Aleppo, although he did it from the air and not with ground forces. And it's not a surprise that he is miscalculated and we should talk about how he's miscalculated, because it's important to understanding what our options are. But Putin is a man who believes himself to be on a historic mission. He saw the opportunity to act now, and finally, he tends to misbehave when the price of oil is about $100 a barrel, because he knows that it'll exert pressure on oil supplies, and we wind up indirectly funding his bad behavior. So I'll say that for starters.
Victoria, would you like to add to that, but also comment on the military operation? All indications are that he thought he could just waltz in and install his own government within a few days. Hasn't happened.
No, it hasn't, which is maybe the most remarkable thing about this, because there has been a prevailing perception that Putin is 100 feet high and never sleeps and, you know, eats nails for breakfast and all of these good things. And it perhaps turns out that things aren't as fantastic in Mother Russia as we have been led to believe. And I just say, you know, in terms of how did we get here, I think we got here because of a fundamentally flawed assumption, which was that after the Cold War, the progress towards liberal democracy and capitalism was going to be a linear evolution. And all the United States needed to do was stand back and let it happen. And despite my abiding deep affection for the Bush family, I think that manifested in two sort of seeds in 1989 that then resulted in what we're seeing today. One was the so-called Chicken Kiev speech, in which then President Bush decided not to celebrate the fall of the Berlin Wall and really push back on Russia. And the other was Tiananmen Square. And the assumptions behind both of those decisions, made by people I deeply respect, was that if we just stood back, this would happen. And Eastern Europe and Russia would follow in this path toward democratization and liberalization. And the worst thing we could do would be to in any way alienate them. And unfortunately, that turned out in both the case of Russia and China not to be the case. And we now have a situation where I strongly agree with Ed. I think you have both President Putin and President Xi looking at the events of the last year and saying, we may never get a better chance. And so things I would have thought not impossible, because nothing's impossible in this line of work, but things very unlikely 13, 14 months ago, they're now willing to roll these dice. And I think, as Raleigh said, this has not turned out the way Putin thought it would, because it wasn't terribly well organized, planned, and it certainly has not been well executed. And so the other thing that has happened, which I think has come as a great shock to particularly the Russians, who consider themselves master manipulators of information, is the way the Ukrainians have seized the public relations space and just dominated it in a way I don't think we could have foreseen either. But it has created just a massive outpouring of sympathy for the Ukrainian people. And I think we see this in this room tonight. You know, I'm not going to question anybody's geography creds, and we can all, you know, take turns with the map later. But most Americans 6 months ago couldn't find Ukraine on a map. Now people care intensely about it, and they realize why it matters. And that's the last thing I'd say is, you know, it is a large country. It has enormous natural resources. It has enormous agricultural resources. This is going to screw up supply chains. This year is going to look good compared to what's coming. And that's why it matters. And I think the American people who remember the Russians aren't our best friends have just a visceral understanding of this. And so I think that's why we're seeing so much interest from the country on what might seem like kind of a niche issue.
Thank you. How could Putin have so miscalculated? And Ed, you and I have talked about this, and it's interesting. Today I was talking to one of my former colleagues, and he was telling me an anecdote which totally rang true to me, which was during the Cold War, during the Cuban Missile Crisis at CIA headquarters, there was a small cabal in the director's office, the director of Central Intelligence, who all were gung-ho and thought this was the greatest thing ever. But everybody else in the building was sort of going, huh? Are you kidding me? And so when I heard that, I sort of thought, is this what was going on with Putin and his intelligence experts and his military? I don't know, but Ed, what do you think?
So for starters, look at the power structure that keeps Putin where he is. And it's largely the people who have looted Russia, right? The people who are billionaires, and the FSB, the security apparatus. He's very mistrustful of the military. The head of the military, Shoigu, isn't a career military man. He's an engineer. And the military has been shortchanged by a lack of resources and by incredible corruption run by people who are not military people. The security services are the ones, and specifically the KGB broke into the SVR and the FSB. The FSB is the Internal Security Service, which has a foreign intelligence operations division. What's interesting, the head of the FSB, who's a guy that Putin knew in the 1970s, he is in very close contact with Putin. However, his principal deputy for foreign intelligence and that man's principal deputy, Lisea is the guy's name, they were both arrested this past weekend. Putin is looking for someone to blame for this problem. You heard that there are assassin teams, likely Chechens, who were after Zelensky, and that on at least 3 occasions, the assassins met with an untimely death. The speculation is that FSB tipped Zelensky's people off. I don't know if it's true. However, it fits into a narrative that suggests Putin miscalculated because he did not fully understand the capability of his military. Unlike Chechnya, Georgia, and Syria, Aleppo, it wasn't the Russian Air Force that was doing the lead fighting. These were ground troops. And 40% of the ground troops are conscripts. And pretty reliable estimates from numerous sources suggest as many as 10,000 of those Russian ground troops have died. At least 12 senior military officials have died. Putin thought this was going to be a 2 to 3 day encounter. They'd be greeted as liberators in Kiev. The Ukrainians would just melt and run, sort of like the Afghans did as we were leaving. Remember, the Afghan president took himself, took his closest people, and as much money as he could and flew out of the country. Zelensky is running around Kiev saying, bring it on, come and get me. I'm going on social media and I'm posing with brave fighters who have fallen in the battle. All of this drives Putin crazy. And the miscalculations he made were, first of all, he did not expect the Ukrainians to fight as ferociously as they have, because he lost sight of the fact that in 30 years' time, they have developed a national identity, separate and apart from Russia. That's what happened in their period of independence. Secondly, he didn't think his military would perform as poorly. And finally, he did not think the Europeans would find a backbone and start pushing back rhetorically, but also in aspirational statements like the German chancellor, Olaf Scholz, who said, we're going to spend our 2% on NATO. So Donald Trump got wrapped over the knuckles because he was a bad man for saying to the Europeans, hey, if you will the end, you have to will the means. Pay your 2%. We're not going to pay the full bill. He was a bad orange man when he did that. Today, you have Sweden and Finland saying, hey, by the way, I think we'd like to join. And for the first time, the European Union has appropriated money for a country that's in a battle so that they could purchase weapons. These are all terrible miscalculations on Putin's part. And that's why he's really cranky. And as CIA Director Burns said, the Russian doctrine of war is to escalate to de-escalate. This is going to be longer. This is going to be bloodier unless somebody stops him.
Let's continue on that theme of NATO. As you both pointed out, a lot of folks had written off NATO as too divided. Was the alliance in trouble? And seemingly, as Ed pointed out, it seems to be coming back. And is this for the long term? And the other question is, what is the appropriate role for NATO to play in this conflict? Victoria?
Well, thanks, Raleigh. And I mean, it's interesting because I think in a way you can say this is the best thing that's happened to NATO, which was in utter disarray after Afghanistan, which we apparently did not coordinate with our NATO partners, the withdrawal. We did not coordinate that with our NATO partners who were there with us, and they had to leave very precipitously as well. And I think in a way that was the greatest moment of crisis for the alliance. But this is the purpose of NATO. The entire purpose of NATO is a defensive alliance against Russian aggression in Europe. And so you could argue Afghanistan was a bridge too far. Interestingly, Article 5 has only been, which everyone speaks a great deal about, and you may have found there are a lot of new experts about Article 5 on Twitter. But interestingly, the only time it was ever invoked was after 9/11. And one of the more interesting things about working for Don Rumsfeld, and there were many, was he did not realize it had happened. As a former ambassador to NATO, he was so busy in the days after 9/11, he didn't even know. Somebody told him after the fact. But in many ways, Afghanistan wasn't NATO's mission. It wasn't central to the alliance. And I think I'd like to see some historical perspective on that down the road. But this is core to NATO's mission. And there are also a lot of experts on Twitter who are opining that this is our fault as the United States because we ever contemplated putting Ukraine in NATO. Well, I think anyone who knows anything about NATO and the benchmarks for getting into the alliance realizes that Ukraine was 20 years out, if that, and that you have to get unanimous consent from all the members of NATO, and now there are 29. And the chances of that happening were zero. So this is made up by Putin. The other argument that is made is that a lot of NATO is somehow Putin's sphere of influence. And so he claims most of Eastern Europe, all of Central Asia, and actually part of the Pacific as his sphere of influence that nobody else can ever touch, or else there's going to be some wild explosion. Well, I mean, you raised the Cuban Missile Crisis. When has he ever issued us that same courtesy of not actually trying to annihilate us from our backyard, as the Russians? So I think this will be fascinating to see what happens for NATO going forward if this does serve as the badly needed wake-up call. One subject I'm looking forward to touching on is the energy topic, and that's central to us here as Pennsylvanians, but it is also a huge part of this. The most interesting man in Washington, Joe Manchin, actually referred to this as an energy war last week. And it was an interesting point coming from a West Virginian who would have a very similar perspective. But this could be, a new lease on life for NATO if Putin makes it relevant again.
I realize I misspoke. If I said the Cuban Missile Crisis, I meant the Bay of Pigs.
Now
it makes sense.
Okay.
During the Bay of Pigs, there was a group around the director who were all gung-ho, but most of the building was shaking their heads and saying, why are we doing this? So not Cuban Missile Crisis. Let me correct myself.
Raleigh, the FSB, and this you have from another number of sources. The FSB was caught by surprise by this operation. So his own intelligence people didn't know what he was going to do. And we had this episode where 2 weeks before the invasion, he had his head of foreign intelligence, whom he upbraided on national television when he did not answer in a facile way to support what Putin was going to do because he couldn't read his mind. So it's Vlad the unpredictable. I want to go back to NATO though, because there was a recent, it looked like a hopeful sign. The Poles were going to send MiG fighters to the Ukrainians to enhance their aircraft capabilities. Since we weren't going to do a no-fly mission for them, they would do it themselves. Now, there is dispute. I can produce military people who say, yes, it would have been very impactful for the Ukrainians to have those planes, and others, especially the Pentagon right now, saying, no, that wouldn't have mattered a bit. Well, truth is always somewhere in the middle, but it doesn't live at the 50-yard line. It's going to be more true on one side than the other. But the Poles said, we'll give you these planes. And the Russians quietly said, if you do, game on. You're putting yourself in the middle of this. You want a piece of this? Go right ahead and do that. And the Poles at that point said, Article 5, an attack against one, NATO members, attack against all. So why don't we do it this way? We'll send the planes to Germany, and the United States can facilitate the arrival of Ukrainian pilots who will fly the planes back to Ukraine. The administration was fine with the Poles sending the planes directly. They said flat out no to the planes being sent to Germany. The Polish press was full of people saying, aha, you see, here's the flaw. It's okay for us to stick our heads in the noose, and you say you're going to come to our aid, but I'm not sure that that's actually going to happen. So I think that, again, the way Moscow is processing things, that was something where Putin looks at that and says, you see, they don't have the stomach for the fight. They could have gotten them those planes if they really mattered. So yesterday, just to, again, test boundaries, they fired on a military base that's 12, 15 miles from the Polish border, just to see what the reaction would be. And I think we keep on failing these little tests of nerve and resolve. Now, the president said, we're not getting in a war with the Russians. Okay, except the enemy always has a vote. So you may think you're not. Vladimir begs to differ.
So what's the resolution? Is this going to just keep going on, or are we going to come up with some sort of face-saving way for Putin to extract himself from this? Victoria.
That's very hard for me to see at this point, given his public statements that if Putin is forced to retreat, you know, the way the Soviets did from Afghanistan, you know, it is hard for me to see how he survives that politically.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that is also very much on his mind.
Well, some have suggested, for instance, let him keep Crimea, where the Black Sea Fleet has been headquartered for decades, longer than that, I think, and parts of Russia that are ethnic Russian, Russian-speaking, Russian Orthodox, as opposed to Ukrainian Catholic, and then come up with some sort of a, you know, a pact, a non-aggression pact, where Ukraine pledges it won't join NATO for 10 years or something like that.
I'm assuming that's what's being discussed in the negotiations, and you've seen sort of little shifts in rhetoric from both the parties, but you know, I don't understand how, you know, if we have as many body bags or mass graves that we appear to have among the Russian conscripts, as Ed said, and we can't claim that we voluntarily, or that we liberated Ukraine from the yoke, and particularly if Zelensky stays in place and becomes a sort of international celebrity, it's hard for me to see quite how that works. So it will be fascinating to watch. I also agree very strongly with Ed that we have lost a lot of the leverage that would help us to drive the kind of outcome we would like. In a way, the things that have happened that are positive have happened despite the United States rather than because of it. It's because the Europeans, suddenly had flashbacks to 70 years ago, and they really don't want that to happen again, understandably so. And it's also because of the extraordinary and largely voluntary activities of private companies. And you've got everybody from Shell to McDonald's who are just walking out of Russia. The Russian stock exchange has been closed for 3 weeks. It basically has no value. They can't reopen it, or else the fact that it has no value will be painfully obvious to everyone. So, these are enormous points of leverage for the United States. We don't seem to be using them to get to a solution that will both retain autonomy for Ukraine, and because I'm also not in favor of World War III, be a off-ramp for Putin, if that's how this is going to play out. But I'm very concerned that we are not, these levers are sort of popping up and they're right there. I mean, are you going to pull it or not? It's a very strange situation.
Ellie, I think we need to, I completely agree with Victoria. I think we need to open the aperture of our geopolitical lens and look more broadly and ask ourselves, how are the Chinese processing this? What role did they have in either encouraging Putin or approving of what he's doing? Now we have these reports that Putin has turned to the Chinese and said, I need money, I need weaponry. He's spending roughly $20 billion a day on this colossal failure. But we should also consider, and again, this is about how our adversaries see us and whether they respect us. I don't want to be loved, I want to be respected. And if you're in this tense situation where Putin is just engaging in mass atrocities, NATO members who are proximate to this are very concerned. He's threatening nuclear war if we put a foot wrong in his mind. But at the same time in Paris, his negotiator is representing our interests in negotiations with the Iranians. I'm not making that up. That is happening. How can that happen in this context if you expect him to respect your point of view, and if you expect that he'll pay attention when you issue your own ultimatum or you draw your own red lines? And remember, Joe Biden was vice president to Barack Obama, who infamously announced a red line in Syria and then promptly disregarded it, which sent a signal to combatants in the region, you don't have to worry about these guys. Do your worst.
Can I just add one quick thing?
Of
to that?
course.
Because I had an exciting experience last week, which is that I published in the UK outlet, the Daily Mail, for the first time, which gets a level of attention that would shock you. In the Wall Street Journal, nothing. Daily Mail, everybody reads it, apparently. You're all reading the Daily Mail. And the piece, they was solicited by the paper, and they said, we're very struck by this Mikhail Ulyanov, who's the lead Russian negotiator in Vienna on the nuclear deal. Because why is this happening was what they were, it was basically the question, and the point in the piece, which unfortunately turned out to be the case, was that the Russians have always seen these two things as linked. And our Secretary of State put out a statement 10 days ago saying, nope, they're not linked, totally separate, Ukraine-Iran deal. But for the Russians, they're totally linked, and everyone was shocked over the weekend when the Russians said, oh, part of the New Deal is no sanctions. And that all of our commerce with Iran is going to be completely unfettered because of the terms of the Frankenstein JCPOA. Like, oh, so it is linked. And what's interesting is, as with the invasion, they may have overplayed because the Iranians were like, nope, gone home. And so they've all gone back to Tehran and they don't really want a part of that. So, mercifully, we may be spared this second terrible deal, but it in their minds, that's how they were playing it all along.
So it's time to go to the audience questions. And the first one addresses the bear in the room. What is the possibility of Putin using a nuclear weapon? Whoever wants to take it.
This is pure speculation. I mean, it really is, because a number of the things he's just done are very predictable. I just don't know the depths of despair that he is feeling right now, because historically, and this is a guy who, the old expression about Irish Alzheimer's, you forget everything but the grudges. The Irish are pikers compared to Eastern Europeans as a group. And that's where my family, my father and mother's family is from. So I'm saying it about our own kind. Putin has to have in mind that Nicholas I lost in Crimea, and 12 years later, Alexander II wound up selling Alaska to the United States because he thought, if I don't, the British will take it. If I sell it to the Americans, I'll get money from them, and at least they'll keep the British from taking it, because the British and the French were the ones who defeated Nicholas in Crimea. In his office, Putin has a bust of Catherine the Great and Peter the Great. Each of those two rulers gained half of Ukraine for Tsarist Russia. So he's always thinking in terms of these grand historic messianic sorts of irredentist ideas. Now, in the last century, we see anybody who's played the irredentist game ultimately lost, but they killed one hell of a lot of people before they got there. And I don't see him using a strategic nuclear weapon, but he's got tactical nukes. Would he drop one into one of the Baltic states where he thought maybe the commitment from NATO isn't quite as firm as it would be if he hit Poland or Hungary? I don't know. And this is where, and I go back to what I teased earlier about his distrust of the military. When the coup attempt happened against Gorbachev, officers in the Russian rocket corps got in touch with their American counterparts and said, don't worry about it. They don't have the launch codes, meaning the coup plotters. Because that's why you do military to military kind of exchanges. And that's why if I were in the White House today, I'd be going through the Joint Chiefs saying, tell me who you know on the other side. And Raleigh, what you used to do, I'd be doing the same thing with intelligence services.
Yeah.
Just to try to figure out what are the chances, can we place a seed and say, by the way, your people are suffering terribly. We don't want this to happen. If this happens, it's going to be beyond redemption. It'd be nice if there was a change in direction, which is a way of saying, why don't you guys handle your own situation without doing something stupid like Lindsey Graham and going on TV and saying, somebody should kill this guy. We shouldn't be talking about that, but our intelligence and military people know how to have those conversations, elicit information, try to figure out mindset. Right now, we're in Churchill's description of the Soviets. The riddle wrapped in a mystery, wrapped in an enigma.
Yeah. Question about China. What role does China play in Putin's decision? What role did China play in Putin's decision to invade Ukraine, if any? And is this Russian incursion a stalking horse for China's Taiwan plans in any way?
That's a great question. And I would say or the People's Republic of China rather, is playing its historic role as a predator. And I think when whatever went down in that conversation between Putin and Xi around the Olympics, and they came up with their grand bargain that everyone was so terrified of, and marked this new era of Russian and Chinese dominance. It hasn't actually worked out that well, and unfortunately, I think there is this sense among the current administration that they can somehow peel China away from Russia, and so National Security Advisor Sullivan was in somewhere, Vienna?
Rome.
Oh, nice. Was in Rome today having a 6-hour meeting, not so nice, with his Chinese counterpart. Hopefully they got time for dinner after. But the idea that somehow the United States has something to offer the PRC that is going to peel them off of Russia is hopelessly wrong. It's like Venezuela, and we can go into that if anyone's interested in it. It's impossible to peel the Venezuelans off the Russians because of Cuba. It's just not possible. And it's the same thing with China. China is betting huge on Russian commodities, primarily energy. They are the largest client of Russian energy, but then it's also going to be food, and it's going to be all sorts of other commodities that they want to corner the market on. There is no other alternative. And they could care less about Ukraine or the people of Ukraine. And so that's not really going to affect their decision-making. I think the only thing that might give them a little bit of pause is the degree to which the Russian economy has been completely isolated. But again, I think they see that as an opportunity. They have their digital currency, central bank digital currency, that they've been cooking up over the course of the last 6 years. They debuted it at the Olympics. Great, impose it on Russia. It's the only way Russia is going to be able to have financial transactions at this point, is going to be through Beijing. Russia doesn't have a choice. And if that be the case, then I think China is going to think this is just fine. Now, in terms of Taiwan, I would say maybe a little bit of a cautionary tale. Taiwan is actually a lot tougher of a nut than Ukraine, and is better armed and better organized. And I think being very sensitive to this kind of PR thing, the last thing Xi wants to do is create an army of Taiwanese heroes on the island who are suddenly going to become international celebrities. And so I think they would start to look at other ways to co-opt Taiwan rather than a direct invasion, which is probably a good thing. But I think if Putin had been successful in 72 hours, we would have a humongous problem on our hands. But this, I think, hopefully would give China pause.
And Victoria, would you agree? Xi is looking at a party Congress in the fall. They're going to give him another term of office. So to the last point you made, he was waiting to see what would happen if if Putin had succeeded at minimal cost. Then he says, this is interesting. Xi's got to be very disappointed today. He's got to be concerned for a lot of the reasons you stated, both the reaction of the Taiwanese, but also if the rest of the civilized world is starting to grow a backbone, that's going to be impactful. Putin, I think, has put this into his calculus and figures it'll pass. They'll put their ribbons away after a period of time. There'll be some other issue that gets everyone all excited. And after all, we have our own climate czar. I would hope that we could finally retire the term czar from any time we give anybody responsibility. But here's John Kerry's reaction, where his greatest concern, as people are being slaughtered in Ukraine, is to make sure that the Russians still abide by their obligations in terms of climate change.
Yeah, like that's going to happen.
I'm not making that up either.
Last point on that, just because there's a Polish connection, which I think Ed's going to like, is there is a Belgian soccer star whose name is Lewandowski, who is Polish national.
Yep.
And he has been sponsored by Huawei. And when it was revealed that Huawei, which of course runs the 5G network in Ukraine, has been participating in the whole surveillance observation program that the Russians are using to try to target Ukrainian leadership, he rejected his sponsorship from Huawei. And I thought that was a really fascinating moment because I mean, I am an American. I don't know much about soccer. I hear it's popular in foreign parts, but these people are enormous celebrities. It's a ton of money. And, certainly having just gotten back from Qatar and seeing what they're doing for FIFA for next year, it's wild. But for somebody to come out and say, no, I don't want this, it is bad for my image to take your money, is a big deal. And so that will be very interesting to watch.
So Victoria, to add to that, it's Western companies without government prompting that have said, deuces, I'm out of here, I'm leaving Russia, I'm not dealing with this. And to show you how extraordinary this modern age is, something that in the past only a national government could do. Here's Elon Musk, when he finds out that the Russians have interrupted Ukraine's internet, he said, not a problem. I will park my satellites over Ukraine and give them internet.
It's Starlink, it's amazing.
It's incredible. Putin had to be sitting there saying, son of a bitch. How did that happen?
Question I can't resist. Can you comment on the seeming success of the American intelligence services in obtaining the Russian battle plan and disseminating it publicly in advance of the invasion, including the Putin lie that the invasion was required to prevent Russian genocide in Ukraine?
Can you read that last? Putin lie.
Including the Putin lie, the disinformation,
okay.
Putin disinformation,
Right, okay.
basically.
Yeah, I mean, I think, it always is a tricky situation when you're dealing with declassification and then the levels to which you declassify and what it looks like and how persuasive the scrubbed information is. It gives me great, I wouldn't say great comfort. It does encourage me that we might have had some insight into that. I'm a little concerned because it did seem for a period of time, particularly in January, they thought it wasn't going to happen or they could somehow preempt it. But certainly revealing, these, just barefaced falsehoods that Putin just repeats and until they take on a certain truth, certainly in Russia, is extremely helpful. And we had the amazing video, if you haven't seen it, also on Twitter, which is apparently where I spend all my time these days, but of the Russian news announcer who had been part of the official apparatus, cut a video today saying they're lying to everybody and then came out on set with a big sign saying, stop the war. And apparently in Russia, it said Russian underneath, it said, they're lying to you. None of this is true. And she's been hauled off and I'm sure will meet a grim fate, but an amazing, kind of outcry from the Russian population themselves, even somebody who has participated in this. So she knows that this is all made up. And the more that can be exposed, I think the better it is for everyone.
Remember when the Soviets shot down Korean Airlines Flight 007?
Yeah.
The United States said that this was a criminal act. Soviets said we didn't do it. And Reagan was faced with a decision. Do I release the communications between the pilots in the planes and their ground control? And his intelligence people said, don't do that. These are sources and methods. Once you've realized, once they know, they won't be useful anymore. And Reagan made the decision that he had to do it because it would have been an inflection point on behalf of the United States in terms of winning public opinion for the hard things that had to be done to deal with the Soviets. I think in this case, when we do the after action report, the revelation of that information will have played some role in changing people's minds or in giving them a cast of mind to say, wait a minute, there's smoke there, there's got to be fire.
Yeah. Just observing it as an intelligence officer, former intelligence officer, I think we really saw, there have been selected instances of release of intelligence information. The Libyan disco bombing was another notable one to justify the attacks on Libya. And, but I think we really saw it in a new way during the 2016 election by the Russians, the weaponizing of information that they had clearly stolen from the Clinton campaign and releasing it selectively at opportune moments via other vehicles, of course, but that's sort of what I would call covert action. And I think perhaps, I don't know this, but perhaps we learned a lesson or two from that and decided to deploy that technique ourselves. Another questions, a couple questions, I'll pair them as we're running out of time. Okay. Do either of you agree with Ludovic Hood's position in today's Wall Street Journal that NATO should move into Western Ukraine?
Sorry for laughing. Luda Hood worked for me for several years. So
Okay.
I might have a somewhat
You
biased
discipline
view.
your employees.
Yes, I did. Well, poor thing's career, he's still there. You know, I understand the logic, and Ludo's still on the inside. So that's the other thing is, you both know, he's dealing with a full deck. I've got at best a quarter deck at this point, and a full understanding of what I don't know. He is a very thoughtful person, and not in any way a radical bomb thrower or somebody who would invite conflict. So I think definitely worth reading and thinking about. And then, the question from that piece, is okay, here's one place we could basically draw a line. And if we don't do it there, where is it? And the thing that troubles me much more than Poland or Hungary is Montenegro, which I think most Americans think of as a made-up country on one life to live. But it actually does exist. We were there, and it's very beautiful and a wonderful place. And more than 50% of its real estate is owned by Russian nationals, and it is a NATO member. So, as I said, I'm a believer in NATO. I believe in Article 5. How do we defend a country? How do we defend those inches against the people who own them? And that becomes incredibly complicated. So is it better to be in Western Ukraine now and sort of mark that off and say, okay, this is our bastion, so we don't have to deal with something like that? That would be the question in my mind.
I agree, and I would say that we talked about this earlier tonight. General Jack Keane, who was here some time ago, that poor guy, I don't know when he's sleeping because he's always on Fox News. Then again, I'm watching him on Fox News, so I'm not.
Also not sleeping.
Jack Keane has said there's a real failure of imagination here. We've got to find a way to get more sophisticated weaponry into the hands of the Ukrainians faster than we are. And really, the shame of it is, had we started to arm them in advance of this attack in a more robust way, maybe Putin tries it, but maybe he doesn't. I'm pretty sure that you would have saved some lives. Yeah. And now he is intent on, there's a new verb. Steve Harrigan, who's a battle reporter, said it's rubbling. And that's what Putin is doing. He is laying this place out So it is nothing but rubble. When the UN went in and looked in Chechnya, they had never seen more destroyed cities, just in terms of the rubble. That's what he's doing now. And every time he agrees to let people have an escape corridor, what's he do? He seeds the place with mines and then he fires on the people. I mean, at some point, the rest of us who are watching this are going to say, I can't take it anymore. At some point, the ire of the publics, not just American, but I think in the civilized world, is going to be roused, whether it's roused to do something within Western Ukraine, or instead we just decide we're going to punish these bastards for the rest of the time. Well, you can do that, but remember this about sanctions, that they won't end anything and they don't protect anyone. Bismarck once said, when the British were kind of yapping, he said, this war will be won not by words, but by iron and blood. I think this is the past yelling at us.
Thanks to you both for a fascinating discussion. And oh, God.
Raleigh, Victoria, Ed, thank you so much for your insight and your time. We hope not to do this again, but perhaps we will need your assistance in understanding this in the weeks and months ahead. Ladies and gentlemen, please again join me in thanking Ed Terzansky, Victoria Coates, and Raleigh Flynn. Thank you. And on this same theme, we'll have a program next Tuesday, Attack on Western Civilization. Victoria will be back with us with Heather McDonald. We are sold out. Go to YouTube. It will be at 6:30 next Tuesday, the 22nd. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful rest of your evening. Thank you.
I did not realize that Heather